Perhaps the most disturbing unsolved murder in our history, well, it remains unsolved. And the problem is, it should have been solved by now. We're going to talk about this and a whole lot more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals interviewed and participating in this show and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Hey, we always begin our episode by thanking each and every one of you who join others in downloading our episode. It humbles us to know so many of you do. Hey, please take the time to reach out with a shout out. We welcome your comments. You can make suggestions, ask questions, you can even disagree. We would love to hear from you. So we say to you, reach out with a shout out. And you can reach us by emailing us at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Again, that's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Hey, just a quick reminder, those who are interested and live in Central Florida, well, there is still time for you to sign up for the State of Florida Certified Gun Course that will help you meet the requirements to be an armed security officer in our state. You see, more and more in this violent world, well, more places, more businesses, well, they're about protecting the people and their property, and they choose to do so with armed security. You can join an instructor who I believe is the best of the best, JimLMauney. He trains law enforcement all over the nation. And for just a very small investment of $200, well, you can be well on your way to a career of protecting others and getting the very best pay in security. That's those armed officers. Well, again, we're going to have that contact in the show notes for you to click on. And then if there are those of you who would like to support this program, as well as supporting law enforcement, first responders, and the military, well, go on over there to peacemakernetwork.com. That's peacemakernetwork.com. There you can become a badge, BADGE supporter, for as little as $3 a month. All of those links, well, they're going to be right there in the show notes. So if you missed it, don't worry about it. Just go to the show notes, and all you got to do is just click that mouse, and you'll be right there. All right, my friend, frankly, the episode we're talking about today is one that we should not be talking about. In other words, we should not be having to tell you about a murder that is still unsolved, especially this one, Jon Benet Ramsey. That precious little girl who vanished, then later was found murdered in her own home. And the sad part of this, well, had mistakes not been made early on in the investigation, well, we just might not be talking about this today. And we're going to get right into that right after our crazy crook story. Well, the story today, our crazy crook, it comes from Brevard County here in Florida. Now, I guess there's nothing perhaps more frustrating than to walk into your home and find that it's been burglarized. Yep, home burglaries, they happen all the time in our nation. Now, thankfully, there are things you can do right now to protect your home. Maybe you ought to do them, because today's story, well, it tells us you just don't have to be too bright to be a thief. Now, one of Brevard County's most scenic streets, well, it isn't known for crime. In fact, resident Mark Skyward, he said that he can understand what might, though, attract thieves to the neighborhood. You see, home values there, well, they're not in the thousands, they're in the millions. He went on to say the affluence of the area, well, it would make it enticing for a thief to come there. However, they ought to keep in mind there's just one road in and one road out. That's what the resident Skyward said. He went on to say it's just too easy to be caught. Well, right there, my friend, is clue number one, that these guys aren't too bright. And then another citizen, well, he had seen something suspicious. This will lead you to fact number two, why these guys are now a part of our Crazy Crook Club. Yep, the story comes from Brevard County, 2 men in a pickup. Now, get this, hold on to your hat. a pickup with a stolen tag written on a piece of cardboard to serve as a license plate. Yep, they were arrested, surprise, surprise, in connection with multiple burglaries in Brevard County. That's according to sheriff's officials. Anthony Sosa, 31 years of age. Chad Dalati, 36. Well, both Anthony and Chad, they were taken into custody Thursday. They do face now multiple charges of grand theft and burglary. And according to a probable cause affidavit, well, the pickup was spotted Wednesday. That was after several houses on Tropical Trail and Merritt Island where the burglaries occurred. Now, the Brevard County Sheriffs went on to say that there they found jewelry worth thousands of dollars and a handgun that they were all stolen from homes. Now, one of the homeowners, they reported to deputies that the pickup that they saw in the neighborhood, it had a piece of cardboard, and it read those words, yep, stolen tag. That was attached where the license plate should be. Now, that pickup was later seen on Panetta Causeway in Melbourne, and it was pulled over by authorities. That's according to the arrest affidavit. Now, people who commit crimes like these, well, the neighbor went on to say, well, they're not the sharpest tools in the shed, that's for sure. The affidavit said deputies searched the vehicle, yep, and there they found stolen jewelry and a handgun in the pickup. And, of course, these two guys, they were both convicted and found out that they had a record. They had been convicted on charges of grand theft, attempted burglary, respective, all the way in Lee County. Well, my friend, I can think of no better way to become noticeable than to place a cardboard sign where your tag should be. It says stolen tag. And, my friend, these two idiots there in Brevard County who put a stolen tag, cardboard sign where the tag should be so that they can be found very easily. They are indeed Charlie Crimebusters, Crazy Crooks of the Week. Now to our main focus, the still unsolved murder of Jon Benet Ramsey. Now, first you might want to say, well, why are we going to talk about that today after so many years, actually around 27 years now, over 25, nearly 27. I won't tell you that in a moment. Now, keep in mind, this was a sensational story when it happened, there on that December day after Christmas, back in 1996. This young lady, she was a beautiful, beautiful little girl. She had actually been a winner of several child pageants. Beauty pageants, that is. And I guess because of the fact that she had that going for her and that she was from a very affluent family, well, this story took the nation and really took over. Now, that was before we have what we have today with the media, social media, to the robust social media we have today. But it did take over, and it was in newspapers all over the country, and it was talked about by the talking heads on TV about this little precious girl that was murdered in her own home. And her mother, Patsy, well, she's a former pageant queen herself. And she had told authorities that she had found that morning a handwritten ransom note on the stairs demanding $118,000 ransom for her daughter. Now, interesting enough, that amount at $118,000, it seemed to be the exact amount of her husband's bonus that year. Pretty good bonus, huh? Back in 1996, I guarantee you, $118,000 was a pretty good bonus. But now, the cops came, and despite an initial search of the house, they did not see Jon Benet's body. In fact, her little body was not found, get this, until 1 p.m. by her father, only after the police had asked him to sweep the home again. And they found her. She had been beaten and strangled. Now, the police said that one of the reasons why they made mistakes was that they actually treated the crime scene as a kidnapping and not a murder. And because of that, there was multiple people trespassing in and out of the house, friends of the family, the clergyman, so many people there. And so, of course, the preservation, well, I should say the destruction of all evidence has been called into question for these 27 years. Now, in the days after the murders, well, Jon Benet's family, well, they willingly submitted the DNA samples to investigators. And a CBI report that was completed on the 15th of January all the way over into 2007, Well, now that appears to show that the genetic markers, well, there were genetic markers from an unknown male, which could have served all the way back then in those days to exclude the Ramseys and other members of the inner circle. Now, to get a timeline, of course, they found the little girl there in the day after Christmas. And already, immediately, the police began to point their fingers at the parents as suspects. And on December the 29th of 1996, well, then the family, they flew back to their hometown of Atlanta. And Jon Benet, the little girl, well, she was laid to rest there in Marietta, Georgia. They actually buried her on New Year's Eve. And her grave was unfortunately beside that of her older half-sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth had died in a car accident in 1992. Now, to get an idea of the timeline, we had the investigation, we had her death, had the investigation, and the very next month in 1997, well, Jon Benet's parents, they gave a public interview to CNN on New Year's Day. That was from Atlanta. Now, at that time, the Boulder Police, they were saying to the community, there's no killer at large. You see, that says to us from the very beginning, as often investigations do, they begin to focus on the loved ones in the home. They begin to focus on the parents as perpetrators of this horrific act of murdering this little girl. However, and that CNN interview, Mama Patsy, she disagreed. She said to the folks, there is a killer loose. If I were a resident of Boulder, she went on to say, I would tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there. She went on to add that America's suffering because they've lost faith in the American family. Went on to say, we are a Christian, God-fearing family. We love our children. We would do anything for our children. And yet the Boulder Police was still looking to Jon and Patsy as the suspect. Now, as you imagine, that interview was not well received by the Boulder Police. They immediately sent 5 detectives up there to Atlanta. And they were shocked that the family claimed that they were too emotional to be interviewed by investigators, but yet they were able to do a CNN sit-down. Now, maybe there was a reason why they appeared to be standoffish to investigators. Well, that reason is very simple. They learned very early in the investigation that the police had developed what I call tunnel vision. They only saw these parents as suspects. So rightly, if you're going to be a suspect, you better be careful what you say to the police. And indeed, in April 1997, parents were identified as the prime suspects. On April 1919 in 1997, well, the Boulder District Attorney's Office, well, they officially labeled Patsy and Jon Ramsey as the main targets of the investigation. Obviously, the focus is on these people. That's what DA Alex Hunter said at the time. Now, the previous month, remember I told you about that handwritten note that was left there when they thought the child had been kidnapped? Well, a handwriting analysis, they ruled out Jon as the person who wrote the ransom note, but they did not rule out Patsy. So again, the focus is on the parents. Now, the parents, they did not sit down formally with investigators till the 30th of April. 1997. This is just a few months after the murder. And then they held a press conference to announce their innocence. Now remember, she was murdered on 25th of December, 1996. Well, a few more months later, July, from April to July 1997, to kind of give you a timeline, they did release the autopsy. Now the autopsy, it was unsealed, notes says on the 14th of July, 1997, and there the coroner found a deep ligature around the victim's neck, another one around her right wrist, evidence that she was bound and strangled. Blood and abrasions were found in the girl's vaginal area. And they also said she was struck on the head violently, enough to cause bleeding, 8.5-inch fracture to her skull. That's what the autopsy stated. Then in March of 1998, this is 2 years later, they did convene a grand jury. And a grand jury that was convened, well, that was the same year that they actually brought out a Colorado Springs detective. Brought him out of retirement. He was doing investigation there alongside the other officers. However, this one they brought out of retirement, he resigned. Resigned the same time the grand jury was convened. And he resigned out of protest over how the Colorado police there, the Boulder Police there, was handling that case. Incidentally, you're going to hear a little more about that detective that resigned in just a moment. So the jurors in this grand jury, they spent months poring over the evidence, including the DNA, the 911 call, and a little teddy bear. That was, of course, when the grand jury was convened. Now, also in 1998, the investigators interviewed Jon Benet's little brother, Burke. He was 9 years of age at the time of the sister's murder. Some suspicion was on him, by the way. But now get this, in October 1999 now, after that grand jury had been brought together in 1998, well, that grand jury was dismissed. It was dismissed in 1999 with the district attorney's office saying, quote, there was not sufficient evidence to bring any charges. Now, interesting enough, a good number of people on that jury had voted to indict her parents. Now, that same year, Jon Benet's 12-year-old brother, Burke, he was ruled out as a suspect. So here we have this little girl. She's been murdered. The focus immediately went on the family. And there were all kinds of gives and takes on that. There was another investigator brought in, a retired guy from the bench to help with the investigation. He didn't like the way the Boulder Police was handling everything, and particularly how they just zeroed in on the fact that there was no intruder. In fact, that there was evidence they thought that pointed to the parents. He didn't think that. So then the family, well, in order to kind of fight back on all of this terrible publicity that they're getting, well, they published a book proclaiming their innocence. It was a New York Times bestseller in 2000. It was called The Death of Innocence. Actually, they also gave a sit-down interview to Barbara Walters, and they have steadfastly maintained no one from the family killed Jon Benet. And in 2006, now this is just 2006 from 1996. We're looking like about 10 years later. Well, Patsy, the mom, she dies. She died of cancer in 2006. And interesting enough, that same year, there was a teacher, a guy by the name of John Mark Carr. He actually confessed that he murdered Jon Benet Ramsey. However, that confession was cleared because DNA did not match the samples at the scene. And then in 2008 now, finally after 1996, well, new advancements in touch DNA, it absolutely cleared the Ramsey family. Boulder authorities even sent a letter of apology to the family. But my friend, after all that publicity, suspicion, public perception, it still remained. Even to this day, there are people who think that her parents are the suspects who actually did the deed. Now, since that time, the family has continued to push for justice. In 2015, Jon Ramsey again sat down with Barbara Walters to revisit the case. Next year, Burke, who's now a young man, he gave a televised interview to Dr. Phil, proclaimed his innocence. And Jon Benet's father, well, he has continually petitioned Colorado authorities to order new, more detailed DNA tests. And he wanted to perhaps use that to get into, this idea of finding family DNA and find this person who did this terrible deed. Now, he spoke last year at a crime conference. This is an annual weekend event for true crime enthusiasts, authors, investigators. And he spoke there, and he said that they need to be using these new methods of DNA. And then in November 2022, probably because of all the, pressure again, and now more podcasts going on about it, well, they issued a release, said that it's an ongoing homicide investigation. They said they'll be consulting with the Colorado Cold Case Review. That was back in 2023. And they went on to now say that they've really put this on the front burner. In fact, they said since Jon Benet's murder, well, detectives investigated leads stemming from more than 21,000 tips, letters, and emails. Said they traveled to 19 states to interview and speak with more than 1,000 individuals. said now they're also working with the FBI, CBI, and several private laboratories across the country. Now, they did say that the amount of DNA evidence available for analysis is extremely small, very complex, and they said that sample in whole or in part could be consumed by DNA testing, so we've got to be careful. But there have been several discussions with private DNA labs about the viability of continually testing this DNA. And then, of course, they would be going to genetic genealogy analysis. Remember, that's how they caught the Golden State Killer. So the Boulder PD, they said that the active investigation continues to receive assistance from federal, state, and local partners. All right, let's you and I talk about why this is still an ongoing case. My friend, one of the reasons this case is unsolved is the very way that it was investigated. You and I both know the first mistake was to treat this case as a kidnapping instead of a possible murder. My friend, there is a solemn truth in investigations, and that is you only have one chance to investigate a fresh crime scene. That's when it's fresh. And oh, my friend, it was clear from the very beginning the Boulder Police Department, they were not prepared nor properly trained to handle this kind of case. They simply did not do the one thing that everybody knows you do. You lock down, preserve the crime scene. They did not do that. Even if it was a kidnapping and not a murder, they still should have locked it down and preserved the scene. Then the police overlooked facts. They misinterpreted other evidence. You see, this little girl was found bludgeoned, strangled, hidden underneath a white blanket, nylon cord around her neck. Her wrists had been bound above her head while her mouth was covered using duct tape. And her body was not found by the police. No, they did. They did clear the house, but they didn't do it very well. Because one of the detectives said to the father, well, take this friend of yours, go around and see if anything else is missing. And then her body was found, amazingly, by her own father, 8 hours after she was reported missing. The child, of course, Jon Benet, found in the basement of the home in the wine cellar, found by her own father. And that was only because the police told him to go search. The first and biggest mistake, well, the family was allowed to remain inside the home once the ransom note was found. Then the family called their friends to come over to comfort them, even the clergyman. My friend, this crime scene was destroyed piece by piece. Now, while the police had photographed the home and the basement, they did fail to check the wine cellar where she was eventually found. And again, that one detective told John, go around the house, see if anything out of the ordinary. And so, he did find her. He went on to say, the father did, she had tape over her mouth and wrists, tied over her head. I immediately took the tape off her mouth. I tried to untie her wrists. I scooped her up. Any father would have probably done the same thing. He took her upstairs, and then the detective told him she's already gone. You see, had the police thoroughly checked the house, come across the crime scene, well, that evidence would have been preserved. It would have been kept sterile, since no one had been there since the killer. But now, well, now it's too late. And then the Boulder Police, they were convinced without strong enough evidence that John and Patsy had been behind the death of their child. They believed the ransom note was written on one of Patsy's notepads was a cover-up that were trying to deflect attention away from the murder. You see, they had thought. Get that word, thought. They thought since Jon Benet was a bedwetter, well, she probably wet her bed. After Patsy then became enraged and slammed her head against something with either parent, then strangling her. They also believed there had been no sign of an intruder entry or exit. That, my friend, was very misleading. Here was the problem. They thought. However, evidence said different things. You see, while there had been foreign DNA found around the underpants of Jon Benet, that did give a strong possibility someone else to come into the home. Well, the police, they just discredited that. They just said, no. I guess they just wanted to overlook that. That case was not being treated right, and there was misleading information. They said that the family was not willing to cooperate. They were willing to cooperate, but in fact, the police just wanted to turn their guns toward them. Yep, tunnel vision. Sometimes police departments get that. They thought that it was all the parents. And as it turned out, the handwriting of the ransom note, well, now it's been proved it's not a match to any of the Ramseys after it was carefully examined many times. And the family, they were constantly put under pressure, question several times, try to pressure them into false admissions. Now, remember I told you about they was bringing a guy out of retirement to try to help the case. His name was Lou Smits. And he was very deeply connected to the case. He put forth another theory. And that theory was totally overlooked by the Boulder Police Department and others involved in the case. He said there had very likely been an intruder who broke into the home of the Ramseys. You see, he was able to find a few discrepancies in the no intruder theory. First thing stood out to him was that even though an intruder exit and entry point had been dismissed, well, he could find where easily someone could come through there. He even was able to identify a footprint on one side of the house. Now, they initially said the amount of snow, well, there would have been all kinds of footprints. Well, that wasn't true. Wasn't that much snow there. And on the other side of the house, there was no snow, and it had a shoe mark, a print that was not matched to anyone else in the house. That was the first clue, my friend, that there was a possibility of a foreign entry into the home. Another major clue was a small metal grate that was on the ground outside the house, you see. You could easily see it had been lifted up, moved apart, had enough space for a person to get through and slip into the wine cellar. That's where Jon Benet was found. He even tested the entry, showed them how someone could have gotten in through that grate. They didn't even have to break in at all. They just go through that little grate, move it, and walk in and get into the wine cellar, and there you're there. There's even a suitcase that you can climb up on to get in and out of. You see, Smith was convinced that the police had tunnel vision. They weren't looking at the truth of the evidence. And the reason, my friend, the reason we're talking about this today, well, there's now great advancement in DNA, and there are areas where DNA that remains can be used to build that DNA profile that would lead to generational DNA investigation that could point us to the killer. My friend, get this word out. Send this podcast around, because the Boulder Police must cooperate and work with available tools that are there. I believe that this case can be solved. Let's just hope that the Boulder Police will put aside their pride and reach out and get the help from some of these scientific laboratories that could take the available DNA and match it and find a way to do a generational investigation to lead us to the suspect, just like the Golden State Killer was caught. Well, there you have it. That's why we're talking about it. Still needs to be solved. And there are lessons that we can learn. You see, it's easy now for us to find fault in how the Ramseys placed Jon Benet in the public eye. Remember, they took her around to these child pageants, these child beauty pageants, and some of you sit back and you say, how dare they? How dare they do that? Yet, let me remind you, parents every day in this country do the same thing through social media. Just this past week, I posted and warned parents to watch what you post. I call it pause before you post. So many people are putting pictures out of their beautiful children, and they are probably being seen by far more people than saw Jon Benet perform in those child pageants. My friend, they could even track you to where you are by your photos. Did you know that? So please, be careful. Take a lesson. Pause before you post. Lesson number 2, secure your residence. Now, you can blame Jon Ramsey for not having enough alarms and not having a secure enough residence that somebody could get in there. He could afford it. He was a very influential person, very wealthy man. He could afford to have that house a little more secure. And you can as well. You see, alarms are now affordable. You could give up a few evenings going out to eat and put alarms on your windows and your doors. Pause before you post. Secure your residence. And lesson number 3, be aware of your surroundings. Someone can always be watching, planning. You see, someone planned this murder. Someone watched the residence. And there could be someone watching you, and you would not even know it because you can't get your nose out from your phone to look around. So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert. For the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com. If you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.